The head of nursing called him a waste of a uniform in front of the entire staff. 17 people heard it. Nobody said a word. Mason Reed stood in the middle of Ashford Ridge Memorial's emergency corridor, rain hammering the windows, his scrubs damp from a double shift, and took it, because he always took it. They thought his silence meant weakness. They thought the tired man in faded green scrubs with no credentials on his lanyard and no sharp comeback was nothing. They were wrong about all of it, and that mistake was going to cost them everything. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The shift had started the way most Tuesday nights started at Ashford Ridge Memorial. Slow, then suddenly not. Mason had taken the double because Priya called in sick again and nobody else wanted the overnight. That was fine. He was used to being the one who stayed. He'd been filling gaps at this hospital for 3 years, picking up extra shifts, covering floor assignments, quietly handling the cases that other nurses found too messy or too complicated or too much. He wasn't the fastest on the floor, and he wasn't the most charming. He kept to himself. He didn't flatter the attendings or laugh at the wrong moments. He just worked. That was apparently a problem. "Reed," the voice cut through the corridor like a blade. Donna Hartwell, director of nursing operations, was walking toward him with that particular stride she used when she'd already decided something and just needed someone to deliver it to. She was a tall woman, late 50s, silver hair pulled so tight it looked painful. She wore her authority the way some people wore jewelry, constantly, and making sure you noticed. Mason finished checking the IV line on the patient in Bay 3 before he turned around. He didn't rush. That also apparently was a problem. "You need to keep up with your documentation timestamps," she said when she reached him. "I've had 2 attending physicians flag your charting this week. Dr. Lowe flagged it because I noted the delay in the patient's pain management order. That's accurate documentation. And Dr. Ferris flagged it because I added an observation note that contradicted his original assessment. That note turned out to be correct." Hartwell's expression didn't change. "That's not the point." "Then what's the point?" "The point is that I have physicians who are frustrated with your approach, and I need staff who can work within the system, not against it." Mason looked at her steadily. "The patient in Bay 3 had a potassium level that nobody caught on the initial workup. I caught it. She would have gone into cardiac arrest within the hour. That's not... Is it about the patient, or is it about the documentation format?" The hallway had gone quiet in that specific way that happens when people want to seem like they're not listening, but absolutely are. 2 nurses near the supply station had stopped moving. An orderly by the elevator was staring at his shoes with unusual intensity. Hartwell stepped closer. Her voice dropped just enough to carry a different kind of weight. "I've been reviewing your personnel file, Reed. You have no specialty certifications beyond your RN, no advanced degree, no formal trauma training on record. You've been at this hospital for 3 years, and you've been passed over for the charge position twice, which you didn't even apply for. You seem comfortable being the absolute minimum, and I will not allow comfortable mediocrity to create friction with my medical staff." Mason didn't move. He let the words sit in the air between them. He didn't clench his jaw or look away. He just stood there the way he always stood, still, balanced, his hands loose at his sides. And he said quietly, "If that's what you think you're looking at, Director, then we're seeing very different things." Her chin went up. "I want you off the floor by end of shift. I'll have Ramirez cover your remaining hours. Submit your patient transition notes to the station before you go. I have 3 patients mid-care. Ramirez will handle it." Ramirez has never run a concurrent sepsis protocol. Mrs. Okafor in Bay 7 needs... "I said Ramirez will handle it." Her voice had gone flat and final. "This isn't a negotiation, Reed. You're dismissed for tonight. Human Resources will be in touch about a formal performance review. I'd suggest preparing documentation of your own." She turned and walked back toward the nursing station. Nobody in the hallway looked at Mason directly. The orderly suddenly found something important to do on the other side of the elevator. One of the nurses, Tasha, who Mason had covered for 3 times in 2 months, quietly turned back to her computer screen. Mason stood there for a moment. Not from shock, just taking a breath. He pulled the tablet from his pocket and started writing his transition notes right there in the hallway, standing up, documenting everything Ramirez was going to need. Mrs. Okafor's current vitals trajectory. The medication schedule for Bay 3. The flag he'd put on the patient in Bay 9, who'd been presenting with altered mental status that the attending had dismissed as anxiety. He spent 11 minutes on those notes. Not because anyone asked him to be thorough, because 3 people's nights depended on information being right. Then he clipped the tablet to the station counter, pulled his jacket from his locker, and walked out through the ambulance bay doors into the rain. The parking lot at 11:40 p.m. was almost empty. Mason's truck was parked near the back because he always took the far spots. Habit from years he didn't talk about. The rain was coming in sideways now, the kind of Tennessee spring storm that couldn't decide if it wanted to be a drizzle or a flood, and settled on something miserable in between. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, let the rain beat against the roof. There was a gas station cup of cold coffee in the cup holder from 8 hours ago, and he drank some of it without tasting it. He wasn't angry. That was the thing people always seemed to expect and then found slightly unsettling, that he wasn't angry. Or if he was, it lived somewhere deep and quiet, where it didn't make noise. He was tired. That was real. 3 years of this specific kind of tired, which wasn't about the hours or the workload, but about spending every shift proving something that never stayed proven. You'd save a patient, and by the next morning, it was just the baseline expectation again, not evidence of anything. You'd catch something other people missed, and it would be reframed as you causing friction rather than you doing your job. He'd learned not to argue with that particular logic because there was no bottom to it. He pulled out his phone. There was a text from his neighbor, Grady, asking if he wanted to watch something on Thursday. There was a voicemail from his sister that he hadn't listened to yet. There was nothing from anyone at the hospital, which was exactly what he'd expected. He was about to start the truck when the radio on the ground near his passenger seat, an old scanner he kept out of a habit he couldn't fully explain, crackled with something that made him stop. All units, MVA with reported gunshot wound, victim en route to Ashford Ridge Memorial, ETA 6 minutes, condition critical. Mason sat very still. He looked at the hospital entrance, then back at the scanner. Critical. 6 minutes. He had already gotten out of the truck before he fully decided to. The ambulance came in hot, lights still strobing when they wheeled the gurney through the bay doors. Mason was already inside by then. He'd come in through the side entrance, technically off shift, technically dismissed, but nobody was going to stop him in the next 30 seconds because what he was seeing told him there wasn't time to worry about technically. The paramedic running alongside the gurney, young, maybe 24, her ponytail plastered flat from the rain, was already calling it out. GSW to the left lateral thorax, suspected pneumothorax. BP's been dropping since mile marker 9. We had him intubated and lost the tube twice. Mason fell into step beside her without anyone inviting him. Breath sounds? She glanced at him sideways. Hesitated 1 beat. Absent left side. Tension pneumo. You need a needle decompression now, not in the bay. We're 30 seconds from the... If he's crashing, he's not making 30 seconds. He didn't raise his voice. He just said it the way you say something true. You have a 14 gauge in that kit? She read something in his face that made her hand go to her bag without further argument. The charge attending, Dr. Ferris, the same Dr. Ferris who'd flagged Mason's chart that week, came through the doors at a jog and stopped when he saw Mason. Reed, you're off shift. He's tensioning. Mason took the needle from the paramedic and positioned himself without asking permission, because asking permission wasn't the priority. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular line. He looked at Ferris. You want to do it, or do you want to keep having this conversation? Ferris stared at him for 1 full second. Then he stepped forward and took the needle, and Mason guided his hand placement with 2 words. And when the pressure released and the patient's saturation started climbing back up on the monitor, the paramedic exhaled so hard it was almost a sound. They got the patient into Trauma Bay 1. And that's when Mason saw the ID card that had clipped to the man's jacket and was now sitting on the tray beside the gurney where the paramedics had set his personal effects. It wasn't a hospital card. It wasn't a driver's license. The emblem on it was one Mason hadn't seen in a long time, but recognized in the way you recognize something that used to define your entire existence. Black background. A specific insignia. Letters that most people in this building had never seen up close. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. Then he looked at the patient's face. The man was unconscious, intubated, late 40s, a jaw that looked like it had been broken and reset, a scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone that was not from any accident. His hands, even slack and unresponsive on the gurney, had the particular muscle structure of someone who had spent years carrying things that weren't meant to be carried. Mason stepped back from the gurney and let the trauma team work, but he stayed in the room. It was Ferris who noticed him still there 15 minutes later, when the immediate crisis had been managed and the patient was stabilized enough that the room had exhaled. "Reed, seriously, why are you still here?" "Who admitted him?" Ferris frowned. "Paramedics brought him in, I told you. Who knows he's here? Who's been notified? Standard protocol, we've contacted. Has anyone run that ID?" Ferris looked at the tray, looked at Mason. "It's a government ID of some kind. We're waiting for—" "Don't wait." Mason's voice was level. "Call the number on the back of that card. Right now, tonight, before anyone else comes through those doors." Ferris crossed his arms. "I'm not taking patient management direction from a nurse who was dismissed 2 hours ago." "Then take it as a suggestion from someone who's seen what happens when that particular ID gets ignored." Mason held his gaze. "Make the call, doctor." Something in his tone, not a threat, not even urgency exactly, just the absolute bedrock certainty of someone who knew something they weren't explaining, made Ferris pick up the card. He turned it over, read the number on the back. His expression shifted in a way he probably didn't intend anyone to see. He stepped out of the room to make the call. Mason pulled a chair to the corner of the trauma bay and sat down. He wasn't going anywhere. At 1:17 a.m., Tasha knocked on the trauma bay door and told Mason that Director Hartwell wanted him out of the building and was threatening to call security if he didn't leave voluntarily. At 1:19 a.m., Mason told Tasha gently that she should go back to her station and make sure Mrs. Okafor's next vitals check happened on schedule. At 1:23 a.m., Donna Hartwell came herself. "I made myself very clear earlier tonight," she said from the doorway. Her arms were folded. She was still wearing the authority like it was structural to her body. "You are not on shift. You have no standing to be in this room." The patient needed someone with him. He has a team. He's alone in a room, and someone is going to come through that door looking for him. I'd rather that someone found me here when they do. She stared at him. "What are you talking about? Have you looked at his ID?" "Dr. Ferris is handling the notification protocol." "Director." He said her name quietly, but in a way that made her actually pause. "In about 40 minutes, this hospital is going to have visitors that you've never dealt with before. And how the next few hours go is going to depend a lot on whether the right decisions were made in the last hour." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to help you not be standing in the wrong place when those doors open." She looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she'd expected him to say, an argument, a grievance, something she could dismiss, it hadn't been that. "You have until Dr. Ferris comes back," she said finally, and left. At 1:44 a.m., a dark blue Ford Expedition pulled into the ambulance bay without its lights on. 2 people got out, both in civilian clothes, both moving the way people move when they've spent a significant portion of their lives making themselves hard to see. They came through the bay doors without stopping at the desk, and the night receptionist, to her credit, started to stand up and say something, and then didn't, because there was something about both of them that said the normal process wasn't the process tonight. The woman in front, 30s, close-cropped hair, a face that gave away nothing, looked around the intake area once and then walked directly to the trauma bay. Not because she'd been told which room, because she'd done that calculation in the 4 seconds it took to cross the floor. Mason was standing in the hallway outside the door. She stopped when she saw him. Just for a beat, less than a second. But it was the beat of someone who recognized something they hadn't expected to find. "Reed," she said. Not a question. "Agent Voss." He said it the same way. Flat, steady, a recognition between 2 people who'd existed in the same world at a different time. "He's stable. BP's holding. They caught the pneumo in the bay. He's intubated but oxygenating." She absorbed this without visible relief, which told him she was in professional mode, which told him this wasn't a courtesy visit. "Who's been in that room?" "Trauma team, 2 paramedics, now gone. Dr. Ferris." "Me." "Anyone else see the ID?" Ferris saw it. He made the call. "That's how you're here." She looked at him steadily. You're on staff here? Not exactly. Not tonight. A brief pause. I was dismissed earlier. Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a question, but she filed it. You stayed. He needed someone in the room. The man behind her, older, heavy-set, a face that had seen too many rooms like this one, was already on his phone. He stepped a few feet away and spoke in a tone too low to catch. Voss kept her eyes on Mason. How long have you been here? Since he came in, about 2 hours. And you recognized the ID immediately. It wasn't a question either. I knew what it meant, Mason said, which was the only part of the answer he offered. She looked at him for another moment, the kind of look that was actually an assessment, a professional reading of someone as a potential asset, threat, or complication. And then she stepped past him and into the trauma bay. Mason leaned against the wall outside and waited. At 2:09 a.m., Donna Hartwell arrived in the hallway looking like she'd aged 8 years since 123. She stopped when she saw the federal agents visible through the small window of the trauma bay door. She stopped again when she looked at Mason. Who are those people? She asked. The people I told you were coming. Her jaw was tight. How did you know? Mason didn't answer. He turned and looked through the window at the man on the gurney, the man with the old jaw scar, and the particular hands and the ID card that had changed the gravity of the entire night. And he kept his counsel the way he always kept his counsel, the way 3 years of ordinary night shifts had not even slightly eroded. We need to talk about your access to federal personnel, Hartwell said behind him. We can talk about whatever you'd like, Director. I'm serious. I need to understand what's happening. So do I, Mason said. And that was true. Because the patient in that room wasn't someone Mason had expected to see in Ashford Ridge, Tennessee. Wasn't someone he'd expected to see anywhere, actually. Not after what happened in the Korengal, not after what the unit had been told. He pushed that thought down, filed it. This wasn't the time. He looked at Hartwell, and something in his expression, not cruelty, nothing like that, just the calm of someone who was no longer operating by the rules of whatever game she'd been playing, made her take a very small step back. Get Dr. Ferris, Mason said quietly. And whoever's on call for thoracic surgery. Your patient is going to need a second procedure in the next 6 hours. She stared at him. Director, please. She went. Inside the trauma bay, Agent Voss set her phone on the tray beside the unconscious man's hand and looked down at his face for a moment that was longer than professional. Then she looked up at the window. She could see Mason on the other side of the glass. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. He's here, she said when the line picked up. No, not the patient. She paused, listening. Reed. Mason Reed. Another pause, longer. Yes, sir. That's exactly what I said. The man on the other end of that call said 4 words that she wrote down on the back of her hand because she didn't trust herself to remember them in the right order. She looked through the window at Mason again. The night shift nurse who'd been dismissed in front of 17 people 6 hours ago was standing in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, arms crossed, watching a door, waiting without being asked, like a man who understood that some things didn't get to be over just because someone told them to be. Voss capped her pen. She had a phone call to make that was going to change the shape of the next several days. And that was going to require Mason Reed to still be in this building when the answer came back. She walked back to the door and opened it. Reed, she said, don't go anywhere. He looked at her with those steady, unreadable eyes and said, I wasn't planning to. Outside, the rain had not stopped. If anything, it was getting worse. The rain hadn't let up by 3 in the morning, and Mason had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing something that's been constant long enough to become background noise. He was standing in the hallway outside the trauma bay with a cup of coffee. Someone had left on the nurse's station counter, cold, probably Tasha's, probably forgotten, when the second vehicle arrived. Not a Ford Expedition this time, a black Suburban with government plates and no markings, and it didn't park in the ambulance bay. It pulled up to the main entrance, which meant whoever was inside had decided they were done being subtle. 3 people came through the front doors. 2 of them Mason clocked as security, not hospital security, not local law enforcement, something else, the way they spread out instinctively when they entered a room, taking corners. The third was a man in his late 50s wearing a jacket that had no business being that clean at 3 in the morning, which meant he'd put it on recently, which meant he'd been woken up and had taken the time to dress properly before coming, which told Mason something about the kind of man he was. Agent Voss met them in the lobby. Mason watched through the hallway window as she spoke to the man in the jacket. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read the exchange. She was briefing, he was absorbing, and once he glanced past her shoulder down the corridor toward the trauma bay, toward Mason. Then Voss pointed directly at Mason. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something to Voss and started walking. Mason set down the coffee cup. The man stopped in front of him. Up close, he had a face that had made a lot of difficult decisions and learned to carry them without showing the weight. Gray at the temples. A way of standing that was completely still but not relaxed. The stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy in environments where wasting it could get you killed. "You're Reed," he said. "Yes. I'm Deputy Director Harlan Moss, DHS. He didn't extend his hand. Not rudeness, just efficiency. "Voss tells me you were the first responder when our man came in." "I was in the building. I helped with the initial decompression." "She also tells me you recognized the credential immediately and held the room for 2 hours before we got here." "I made sure nobody disturbed his effects or his person." "Yes." Moss studied him. "You're listed as a floor nurse here." "I was, until about 8 hours ago." A pause. "Dismissed?" "Dismissed." Moss's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "And you stayed anyway?" "I heard the call on the scanner. Patient came in critical. I came back in." Mason paused. "And then I saw the ID." "That ID is classified at a level that means most people in this building shouldn't be able to interpret what they're looking at. Most people in this building couldn't." Another pause, longer this time. Moss wasn't the kind of man who filled silences with noise, and Mason respected that more than he would have respected a faster reaction. "What branch?" Moss finally asked. Mason looked at him steadily. "That's going to require a conversation I'm not sure this hallway is appropriate for." Something shifted in Moss's face. Not surprise, he was past surprise, but a recalibration, like a man who'd come in expecting to manage a situation and had just discovered the situation was more complicated than the briefing. "All right," Moss said. "Not the hallway." He looked back at Voss and nodded once. "Get me a room." "What?" They used the hospital's small family consultation room off the main corridor. 4 chairs, a table, a box of tissues nobody touched, a window that looked out at the rain-soaked parking lot. Moss sat across from Mason. Voss stood near the door with her phone in her hand like she was waiting for something to land on it. "The man in that room," Moss said, "is named Callum Dre. He's been embedded in a domestic trafficking network operating across 3 states for 14 months. Last verified contact was 11 days ago. We thought he was dead." Mason absorbed this without responding. "The gunshot wound," Moss continued. "We believe he was extracted from his cover position by force. Whether he walked out or was carried out, we don't know yet. But the location where he was found, Route 7, mile marker 9, single vehicle crash, puts him 6 miles from a property we've been building a case on for 8 months." "What's at the property?" "That's not your clearance to," Voss started. "I'm not asking for the file," Mason said. "I'm asking what I need to know to keep him alive." Moss looked at Voss, then back at Mason. "The property belongs to a man named Warren Galt. Regional operations. Distribution, money movement, some evidence of personnel transport that we believe is connected to 3 open federal cases." He paused. "If Dre was burned, Galt knows what he was carrying out of there. And if Galt knows Dre is alive and in a hospital in Ashford Ridge, we have approximately—" He checked his watch. "A narrowing window before someone makes a move." Mason looked at the window, at the parking lot, at the angles. "This hospital has 1 functional security camera on the ambulance bay entrance," he said. "The side entrance I used tonight has a broken lock that maintenance has been meaning to fix for 6 weeks. There are 2 exits from the trauma bay, the main corridor door and a service access that connects to radiology. If someone comes in through the side entrance, they reach the trauma bay in 40 seconds without passing the nurse's station." Moss was very still. "You've clocked this hospital." "I work nights. You learn the building." "No," Moss said quietly. "That's not what that is." He leaned forward slightly. "Reed, I need your actual background before we go any further, not what's on file here, whatever you were before this." The fluorescent light in the consultation room buzzed faintly. Somewhere down the corridor, someone dropped something metal, and it rang out against the floor, and then there was quiet again. 18 years, Mason said. Army. Last 8 years with the 75th, then attached to JSOC as a senior trauma medic on direct action missions. I separated 3 years ago. He said it the way you read off a fact you've made peace with. There's a file. It's buried, but it exists. If you have the right clearance, you can pull it. Voss had her phone out already. Moss hadn't moved. Why a floor nurse in Ashford Ridge, Tennessee? Because it was far enough from everything that I thought I might sleep through the night. A beat. I was mostly right. The door opened and Voss stepped halfway out to take a call. Moss kept his eyes on Mason. The people who shot Dre, Mason said. You think they tracked him here? I think they will, if they haven't already. Mason nodded slowly. I was quiet for a moment, running something. Not math exactly, more like geography and timing layered over each other. The particular mental calculation that had once been as natural as breathing and had apparently never fully gone dormant. Then we need to move him, Mason said. Not the building, the room. Somewhere with a single point of entry and defensible sightlines. And we need to reduce who knows which room he's in. Moss looked at him for a beat. You're proposing to help us secure this. I'm already in it. Mason said it simply. I was in it the moment I walked back through those doors. They moved Callum Dre to a room on the 3rd floor at 3:52 a.m. It took longer than it should have because Dr. Ferris had opinions about moving a recently stabilized pneumothorax patient, and those opinions were not wrong, medically speaking, and Mason agreed with every one of them while also maintaining that the alternative was worse. Ferris eventually stopped arguing when Moss showed him a specific document that Mason didn't see, but that clearly communicated something Ferris found persuasive. Dre remained unconscious throughout, his vitals held. His color was marginally better than when he'd arrived. Mason stayed close to the gurney during the transfer, not because anyone asked him to, because he knew this hospital and these corridors, and the 2 federal agents flanking the move were good at what they did, but didn't know that the elevator they were planning to use had a habit of sitting for 37 seconds before the doors opened, and that was 37 seconds too long in an open corridor. Service elevator, Mason said, without explaining, and took them the other way. They got Dre to the 3rd floor room without incident. One of Moss's security detail posted outside the door. The other took a position near the stairwell. Mason watched how they placed themselves and didn't comment on the fact that neither of them was covering the window, which was 6 feet off the ground and overlooked the service access road. He mentioned it to Voss. She looked at him for a moment and then repositioned the second agent without saying anything else. At 4:15 a.m., Mason went back downstairs to check on Mrs. Okafor in Bay 7, because he'd been thinking about her potassium trend for the last 3 hours, and nobody had told him whether Ramirez had caught the follow-up. She was asleep, her levels stabilized, a new IV running that told him someone had done the right thing. He stood at the foot of her bed for a minute and then went back up. The night was doing that thing it does in the hours between 4 and 5 where it gets very quiet and very still and feels like the world has forgotten to keep going. The fluorescent lights in the 3rd floor corridor buzzed at a frequency that was slightly different from the 2nd floor, and Mason had never noticed that before, 3 years of working this building, and he noticed it now. He was standing in the corridor outside Dre's room, back against the wall, when Donna Hartwell appeared at the end of the hall. She looked different than she had downstairs. Not softer, that wasn't the word, but less armored. Like the night had worn something off her that the day usually kept buffed smooth. She walked toward him and stopped about 4 feet away, and they looked at each other in the buzzing corridor light. I owe you something, she said. Her voice was careful and quiet. Not warm, but honest. You don't need to do that right now, Director. I said some things earlier that were... She paused, pressed her lips together. That were inaccurate. You said what you saw. I understand that. No. She shook her head slightly. What I saw was a file with no specialty certifications and no advanced degree, and I decided that's what I was looking at. I didn't look further. Another pause. These federal agents know your name. The way the man in charge said your name was not the way you say the name of a floor nurse. Mason didn't respond. Who are you? She asked. Not aggressively, almost like she genuinely didn't know how to hold the question. Same person I was at 11 o'clock, he said. Same person I was 3 years ago when I applied for this job. She absorbed that. looked at the door to Dre's room, at the agent outside it. Is this hospital in danger? There's a possibility, Mason said. The agents are managing it. The best thing you can do is make sure your overnight staff stays in their assigned areas and doesn't ask questions about the third floor. She nodded slowly. Ramirez went home sick at 2. I know. I need a nurse for bays 3 and 7. He looked at her. I'm not on shift. She held his gaze. I know. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, I'll need chart access restored. She nodded. He pushed off the wall and headed for the stairwell without another word, and she watched him go, and she didn't say anything else, and the corridor kept buzzing. At 5:40 a.m., the first call came. Mason was in Bay 7 checking Mrs. Okafor's morning labs when one of the night reception staff, a young man named Theo, who'd been at the desk since midnight and looked appropriately destroyed by it, came down the corridor fast enough that Mason heard his footsteps before he saw him. There's a man at the front desk, Theo said, and then stopped because apparently the description was complicated. What does he look like? He says he's family, for the patient who came in tonight. The car crash on Route 7. Theo paused. He knows the room number. Mason set down the chart. He knows which room? He said room 312. Theo's voice had gone a little flat in the way voices go when someone's nervous and trying not to show it. That's the room upstairs, right? With the agents outside? Room 312 was where Dre was. The transfer had happened at 3:52 a.m. Fewer than a dozen people in the building knew the new room number. None of them were supposed to have shared it. Mason was already moving. Call Agent Voss, now. Use the number on the card she gave you. Don't go near the front desk. Go to the side office and lock the door and make the call. Theo stared at him. Theo, now. Theo went. Mason took the stairs. He came through the stairwell door to the main lobby at a controlled pace, not running, nothing that would change the room's temperature, and stopped in the entrance to the lobby, taking the scene in before he entered it. The man at the front desk was medium height, heavy set, wearing a tan jacket that was wet from the rain. He was leaning on the reception counter in the particular way people lean when they're trying to look casual and haven't practiced it enough. There was a second man near the entrance, standing with his hands in his pockets, positioned slightly to the left of the door, not looking at the desk, looking at the room. Mason cataloged this in about 2 seconds. The man near the door wasn't waiting for someone. He was covering an exit. The woman at the front desk, not Theo, the overnight reception supervisor, a woman named Barb who had been doing this job for 22 years, was speaking in a very careful and measured voice that told Mason she had already decided something was wrong and was buying time. I'm sorry, sir, I can't confirm patient room numbers without going through our admission verification process. I already told you, the man at the counter said, not loudly, but with a particular quality of patience running thin. My brother came in tonight, car accident. I got a call from the hospital. We don't call family members with room numbers. Lady, I just drove 2 hours in this rain. Can you just... Excuse me, Mason said. Both men looked at him. Barb looked at him. There was a half second where everyone was looking at him and nobody was looking anywhere else. And in that half second, Mason moved from the doorway to a position that wasn't between the two men, but wasn't not between them either. Just a place in the room that happened to be exactly equidistant from both exits. Are you with the family? He asked the man at the counter. His voice was pleasant and completely empty of anything else. Yeah, my brother. He was in an accident on Route 7. I understand. I worked with him when he came in tonight. A partial truth. Can I ask your name? Abit. Devin. Devin. Mason nodded. I'm going to need you to come with me to our family consultation room, and I'll pull up the chart and get you the information you need. It'll just take a couple minutes. I just want the room number. Hospital policy doesn't allow me to give room numbers at the desk. Consultation room's right here. Won't take long. He gestured toward the corridor, the same corridor he'd walked Moss through, the corridor that led away from both exits and toward the part of the hospital where Barb was not. Devin looked at Mason. Mason looked at Devin with the expression of a tired overnight nurse doing a routine procedure. Nothing more, nothing less. Okay, Devin said. He pushed off the counter, and as he did, Mason saw it. The outline under the left side of the tan jacket, the slight forward tilt of his left shoulder, the weight distribution that was off by about 8 ounces from what it should be. He was carrying. Mason's breathing didn't change. His pace didn't change. He led the man around the corner to the consultation room and opened the door. "After you," Mason said. And as Devin stepped through the door, Mason heard the stairwell at the far end of the lobby slam open, and Voss's voice cut the air. "Ashford Ridge PD and DHS, nobody move." And the man by the front door went for his pocket and then stopped because there were suddenly two people between him and the exit with their credentials visible and their hands in specific positions, and stopping was the correct decision. Devin spun around in the consultation room doorway. Mason was already in the room. He'd moved inside while Devin was still turning, putting the door frame between them, and when Devin's hand went toward his jacket, Mason's hand was already there. Not a strike, not a grab, a specific pressure point on the inside of the wrist that made the hand stop working the way it was supposed to, and Devin made a sound that was mostly surprise because it had been so fast and so quiet and so completely unlike what you'd expect from the tired man in scrubs who'd asked his name at the front desk. Devin went down to one knee. Mason held the wrist with one hand and kept his other hand free and stood very still and waited the 4 seconds it took for Voss and the agent with her to clear the lobby and come around the corner. Voss stopped in the doorway and looked at Devin on the floor and Mason standing over him. "I found him at the desk," Mason said. He knew the room number. His partner was covering the front entrance. A pause. "He's carrying a 9 under his left arm. I didn't pull it because I'm not a federal agent." Voss crossed the room and handled it from there. Mason stepped back, leaned against the wall. He was breathing steadily and his hands were completely still, and he was aware that both of those things would have surprised Donna Hartwell if she'd been in the room, but she wasn't, and that was fine. Voss secured Devin and looked up at Mason. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite the professional neutrality she'd been wearing all night. "How did you know to come down?" she asked. "The kid at the desk told me someone knew the room number." "And the wrist control, hospital restraint technique," Mason said, and let that land, and watched her decide how hard to push on it, and watched her decide not to. She handed Devin off to the agent behind her and turned to Mason fully. "Moss needs to see you, now, upstairs. I've got 2 patients in the—" "Now read." Her voice had something in it that wasn't urgency exactly, more like the edge of something she hadn't said yet. "He just got a call. About you." Mason looked at her. "Someone ran your name," she said. "The moment we pulled Dre's file and cross-referenced the responding staff, someone on the other end of a very specific system flagged your name, which means whoever's behind Galt's operation has access to at least one federal database." She paused. "And they know you're here, and they're not just interested in Dre anymore." The fluorescent light in the consultation room did the same buzzing thing as the corridor upstairs. The rain outside had finally started to let up, just barely, just enough to notice. Mason pushed off the wall. "Let's go see Moss," he said. The stairs took 40 seconds. Mason counted them without meaning to, the way he'd once counted everything. Steps to the extraction point, seconds until a window closed, heartbeats in a room that was about to go wrong. Old habits didn't die. They just went quiet and waited. Moss was in the corridor outside Dre's room when Mason came through the stairwell door. He was on the phone, and he ended the call the moment he saw Mason, which meant the call had been about Mason, which Mason had already figured out from what Voss said downstairs. "Walk with me," Moss said. They went to the far end of the corridor, away from the security detail outside Dre's door, away from the nurses' station where a single overnight nurse was pretending not to notice the federal agents occupying her floor. The window at the end of the hall looked out at the service road. The rain had thinned to a gray drizzle, the sky doing that pre-dawn thing where the dark goes slightly less dark without actually getting light. "Someone ran her name through a DHS personnel cross-reference 41 minutes ago," Moss said, keeping his voice low and even. "Not a public database, a restricted access system that requires level 4 clearance or better." He paused. "Which means whoever pulled it either is federal or has someone federal in their pocket." "Galt," Mason said. "Possibly Galt, or someone above Galt. We've had a secondary concern for several months that his operation has an institutional contact. Someone with access to law enforcement or federal systems who sanitizes things. Permits that get approved, complaints that get lost, surveillance requests that get quietly denied." He looked at Mason directly. "If they flagged your name, It means they're building a picture of who's in this building and what they're dealing with. They're assessing threat level. Yes, and whatever they found when they pulled your file, Moss stopped. What would they have found, Reed? Mason looked out the window at the service road. A garbage truck was doing its early rounds, indifferent to all of it. Depends on which file they got to, he said. My official separation record is clean. Honorable discharge, 18 years, medical specialty. Standard stuff. But if they went deeper, if they had access to JSOC operational records or the classified annex to my personnel file, they'd have found mission logs, call signs, a specific operation in 2019 that resulted in the neutralization of a trafficking network's overseas financial coordinator. He paused. That coordinator had domestic partners. The investigation never fully closed on the stateside end. Moss was very still. You're connected to a prior case. I didn't know it at the time. I was a trauma medic on a direct action mission, not an investigator. But if someone is running a domestic operation that connects to what we disrupted overseas, and if that someone has access to classified records, they might have just realized that the nurse who's been sitting in this hospital for 3 years is the same person who helped take apart their foreign operation in 2019. The garbage truck disappeared around the corner. The service road was empty again. That changes things, Moss said, not as a question. It means they have more reason to move fast. And it means whatever play they make, it's not just about recovering Dre or eliminating a witness. It's about eliminating a liability they didn't know existed until 41 minutes ago. He turned from the window. What resources do you have on the ground right now? 2 agents in this building, 3 in vehicles outside. Local PD was briefed 30 minutes ago and has a unit on the perimeter. I've requested a federal tactical team, but the nearest available unit is 90 minutes out. Moss said this with the flatness of a man who understood what 90 minutes meant and didn't need it explained back to him. 90 minutes is a long time if they move. Yes, it is. Then we need to make this building less interesting than whatever they're protecting at the Galt property. Mason looked at him. Dre was carrying something out. Whatever he had, documents, data, physical evidence, it's either still in that crash vehicle or it's on his person. If they're mobilizing to hit this hospital, it's because they don't know which. Moss reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small sealed evidence bag. Inside it was a compact USB drive, matte black, no markings. We found it in the lining of his jacket, sewn in. Mason looked at it without touching it. Have you accessed it? Our tech analyst is working remotely. The drive is encrypted. We've had it for 40 minutes and we've got nothing yet. He pocketed the bag again. The people outside don't know we have it. That's the only advantage we have right now, and it's a narrow one. Mason thought for a moment, not hesitating, processing, which looked similar from the outside but felt different from the inside. Put it out, he said. Moss frowned. What? Put the word out, deliberately, through whatever channel they're monitoring, that the evidence Dre was carrying was not recovered, that we're still looking. He paused. If they believe the drive is still in the crash vehicle or unaccounted for, they split their attention. Some of them go to the vehicle. That's fewer people coming here. Moss looked at him for a long moment. That's deceptive misdirection using a federal communication channel. Yes. Another pause. I'll need to make a call. He pulled out his phone. Stay available. He walked back toward Dre's room, already dialing. Mason stayed at the window. Voss appeared beside him a minute later, 2 cups of coffee from wherever she'd found a machine, and handed him one without comment. He took it. It was bad coffee. He didn't care. The 2 men from downstairs, Mason said. Devin and his partner. In custody. Local PD has them. Neither one is talking. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Devin's clean in every federal database. The partner has 2 priors. Aggravated assault in Alabama. A weapons charge in Georgia that got reduced. Both of them have ties to a logistics company in Knoxville that we've been looking at as a Galt front. So Galt sent contractors, not his own people. For the initial probe, yes, which means he's careful. She drank her coffee, made no face about it, which told Mason she'd been running on worse for longer. The real question is what he sends next. Callum Dre woke up at 6:22 a.m. Not fully. Not the sudden cinematic return to consciousness that Mason had seen in movies, and never once in a real trauma bay. What actually happened was a slow, struggling, confused emergence through layers of sedation, a hand moving before the eyes opened, a sound that was somewhere between a word and a groan, the particular restless quality of someone whose body was done being under, but whose mind hadn't caught up yet. Mason was in the room. He'd come back after the conversation with Moss, taken the chair in the corner, and spent 40 minutes watching Dre's vitals on the monitor and thinking about things he normally had the discipline not to think about. The agent outside the door was a man named Pelletier, who'd checked on Mason twice and seemed to have decided he was a fixed feature of the room. When Dre's hand moved, Mason was already on his feet. "Hey," he said, close but not hovering. "You're in a hospital. You're stable. Don't pull at the tube." Dre's eyes opened. They were unfocused for about 8 seconds, Mason counted, and then they sharpened in a way that was faster than it should have been for someone who'd been through what he'd been through, and Mason filed that away. Dre looked at him, looked at the room, looked at the agent visible through the small window in the door. He tried to speak around the endotracheal tube, got nothing useful, and closed his eyes briefly in frustration. "I'm going to get the attending," Mason said. "The tube can possibly come out if your numbers hold where they are. Give me a few minutes." Dre's hand moved again, not toward the tube, toward Mason's wrist. He gripped it, weakly, but with intent, and his eyes came back open. He looked at Mason and mouthed something. Mason watched his lips. Did it again, slower, and this time Mason got it, the drive. "We have it," Mason said quietly. "It's secure." Something in Dre's face loosened. Not relief exactly, more like a structural tension releasing, like a load-bearing wall that had been holding something up for a long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. His grip on Mason's wrist went slack. His eyes closed. He was back under, not from sedation, but from sheer physical depletion, and Mason stood there for a moment with the released wrist at his side and thought about 14 months undercover inside a network that moved people the way freight gets moved, and what that cost, and what it took to keep carrying it. He went to get Dr. Ferris. The drive cracked open at 7:14 a.m. Moss came to find Mason in the second-floor corridor with the look of a man who had just received information that rearranged the furniture in a room he thought he knew well. "Our analyst got through the first encryption layer," Moss said. He wasn't walking anymore. He'd stopped in the middle of the corridor, and he was speaking with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing each word with awareness that the words mattered. "The drive contains 14 months of documentation, transactions, personnel records, communication logs. Dre was thorough, more than we knew, because not all of it was in his filed reports." "What's the parts that changes things?" Mason asked. Because there was clearly a part that changed things. Moss looked at him for a moment. "One of the communication logs contains the name of a federal contact, someone inside a government agency who's been feeding information to Galt's operation for at least 2 years. Approving things. Blocking things. Misdirecting investigations." He paused. "Vetting people. Running names when asked." Mason understood it before Moss finished saying it. "That's who ran my name tonight." "We believe so. Which means they now know who you are. Full classified record. And they've passed that information to whoever Galt's people are waiting for orders from." He held Mason's gaze. "You're not an incidental presence in this hospital anymore. You're a named target." The corridor was empty. The overnight staff had thinned to a skeleton crew, the morning shift still an hour out. Somewhere below them a cart rattled along linoleum. The hospital breathed its slow, institutional breath, indifferent to the information that had just passed between two men in its corridor. "What agency?" Mason asked. Moss hesitated. "One beat. Just one. We're not certain yet. The analyst is working on it, but the access pattern suggests someone in a coordination role. Not field, not technical, administrative or supervisory level. Someone who sees what's moving but doesn't get their hands in it. Someone who maintains deniability," Moss said. "Until now." Mason thought about Dre lying in that room with the load-bearing tension finally released from his face. 14 months. He thought about that. "They're going to move before you get the tactical team," Mason said. "Possibly." "Not possibly. They know we have Dre, they know we likely have whatever he was carrying, and they now know that what he was carrying includes the name of their inside contact. Every minute that drive sits in this building is a minute closer to someone's career ending and someone else's prison sentence beginning." He looked at Moss. They're going to move. Moss didn't argue. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. The morning shift began arriving at 7:30, which complicated things in the way that ordinary life always complicates extraordinary circumstances. Nurses badging in. A dietary cart making rounds. An attending physician arriving for rounds who didn't know why there were federal agents on the third floor and had a lot of questions about it that Hartwell was running interference on in the main corridor. Mason had been awake for over 24 hours. His body knew it. There was a specific, distinctive weight behind his eyes that he recognized, the kind that settled in during the second day of an extended operation when the adrenaline had metabolized and what was left was something older and slower, but also strangely more reliable. He'd learned, a long time ago, that you could be tired and still be functional. The two weren't mutually exclusive. You just had to stop fighting the tired and let it be part of the background. He was on the second floor when Tasha found him. She'd come in for the day shift, and she had the look of someone who had arrived at work to find that their workplace had become a different place overnight and was still catching up. She fell into step beside him. "Mrs. Okafor's being discharged this morning," she said. "Her son came in." "Good. Make sure the discharge instructions include the dietary restriction sheet, not just the medication list. Her husband does the cooking. The sheet needs to be legible to someone who isn't a medical professional." Tasha was quiet for a step or two. Then, "What happened last night?" "Long shift." "Mason." She said it the way she'd never said it before, with weight, with something she meant. "I heard what Hartwell said to you, in the hallway. I was one of the 17 people." He glanced at her. "I didn't say anything," she said. "I should have." He was quiet for a moment, not letting her off the hook, but not twisting it either. "It's a hard thing to do in the moment. That doesn't make it right." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She stopped walking. "Are you okay?" He thought about all the things that question contained and all the things it didn't, and he said, "I'm working on it," and kept moving, because that was the most honest answer he had. He was passing the elevator bank when his phone buzzed. Moss. He picked up. "We have a problem," Moss said. "One of the vehicles on the exterior perimeter just reported a vehicle that pulled up 2 blocks north and stopped. Dark sedan, no plates visible in the rain. They've got eyes on it, but it hasn't moved." "How long?" 4 minutes. "That's not surveillance. That's positioning." Mason's hand tightened on the phone. "Where's Voss?" "Third floor, outside Dre's room. Move Dre, right now. Not to another room, out of his room, into the service corridor behind radiology. The room itself becomes a decoy. Anyone who comes for that room finds nothing. We don't know they're coming through this building. The front entrance has your agents. The ambulance bay is covered. A team that knows this building, or has someone who's told them about it, uses the side entrance, the broken lock." His jaw tightened. "I told Hartwell about that lock 6 weeks ago." A pause. "Reed, the maintenance order is in the system. If their inside contact has database access, they might have access to maintenance logs. They know the side entrance is soft." He was already moving toward the stairwell. "Move Dre, and get someone to that side entrance." He heard Moss relaying the order before the call ended. Mason went down the stairs fast, not running, controlled, taking them 2 at a time the way you do when the difference between fast and noise matters. He hit the first floor and came through the stairwell door into the ground-level corridor and turned toward the side entrance. The corridor was empty. The side entrance door, 40 feet ahead, was slightly ajar. The broken lock. Someone had already used it. He stopped, pressed back against the wall, ran the math. If they were already inside, they were moving toward the stairwell to his left, the fastest route to the 3rd floor. Or they'd already split, some going up and some holding the exit. He couldn't see them. He could hear very faintly the soft tread of someone who was trying to be quiet and mostly succeeding. The stairwell to his left had a small window in the door. He crossed to it, fast, low, controlled, and looked through. 2 men on the stairs, moving up. Dark tactical gear, no insignia. One carrying something that wasn't a conversation starter. Mason pulled back from the window. His phone was already out. 2 tangos in the east stairwell, he told Moss. Moving up from ground floor, armed. They're going for 3. Copy. We have Dre out of the room. Voss and Pelletier are in position. You need to intercept before they hit the 3rd floor landing. If they get to the corridor and find the room empty, they'll reassess and start clearing. You don't want them clearing in an active hospital. Where are you? Ground floor, east corridor. Stay there. He stayed for approximately 4 seconds, which was the amount of time it took him to calculate that the two men on the stairs were going to reach the second-floor landing before Voss's team could come down from 3, and that the second-floor landing opened directly into the pediatric recovery wing, which had 3 children admitted overnight. He went into the stairwell. He took the first flight in the time it took to breathe twice. The 2 men were on the second-floor landing, and the lead man had his hand on the door to the second-floor corridor about to push through it when Mason's voice came from below them. Calm, clear, completely ordinary. Hey, wrong floor. Both men turned. The one with the weapon brought it up, and Mason was already moving sideways into the stairwell wall, not away from the weapon, perpendicular to it, which changed the angle and bought a half-second. And in that half-second, he took the 3 steps between them and put his left hand on the weapon and his right hand on the man's wrist, at the exact point where pressure translated to grip failure. And the weapon came loose not because he'd overpowered it, but because the joint didn't have a choice. The second man moved, and Mason saw it and took a step back into his path and dropped his weight, and the man went over Mason's hip and down the stairs and hit the landing wall with a sound that was going to leave significant bruising. The first man tried to recover, and Mason took the weapon, stepped back, and held it. "Don't," Mason said. That was all. Both men were still. The one on the floor was breathing but stationary. The one upright had his hands slightly out and was doing the math that all men do when the math comes out wrong. The stairwell door above them, 3rd floor, opened, and Pelletier came through with his weapon drawn and took in the scene with the expression of a man who had been doing this job for 10 years and had not seen this specific configuration before. "They're secured," Mason said. He set the confiscated weapon down on the stair step, barrel pointed at the wall, and stepped back from it. "Pelletier, you'll want to cuff the one on the floor before he decides his shoulder stopped hurting." Pelletier was already on it. He looked at Mason once while he worked, a quick, reading look, and then looked away and kept working. The man on the floor said something. Mason didn't respond to it. He went back down the stairs to the ground floor corridor, came through the door, and leaned against the wall with his hands on his knees and took 3 deliberate breaths. Not from exertion. He was past the point where that kind of exertion registered physically. From something else. The specific weight of a situation that had almost gone sideways into a wing full of children. His hands were steady. He checked because he needed to know. They were steady. Voss came down the corridor at a near run and stopped when she saw him. She looked at the stairwell door, looked at him. "2 secured in the stairwell," he said. "Pelletier has them." "Are you hit?" "No." She studied him for a moment. "The sedan outside just moved. It's gone." She pressed her earpiece. "Perimeter confirms. They're pulling back." She lowered her hand. "They made the call. Whatever signal they were waiting for from inside didn't come." "Their team missed check-in," Mason said, "so they pulled the exterior support, which means they're regrouping." She said it evenly, but the word carried the weight of what it meant. Not over, just paused. "Moss has the tactical team's ETA down to 60 minutes. They diverted a unit from Knoxville." 60 minutes. Mason straightened up off the wall. "I need to check on my patients," he said. Voss looked at him. This man who had just neutralized 2 armed intruders in a stairwell and was now talking about patient charts. And she said nothing for a moment. "Read." Her voice was careful. "When this is over, there are people who are going to want to talk to you. Not just Moss, people above Moss." "I know." "Whatever you've been doing for 3 years, whatever this was." She made a small gesture that encompassed the corridor, the stairwell, him. "It's not going to stay quiet." "It was never going to stay quiet," he said. "Not after tonight." He pushed off the wall and started down the corridor toward the second-floor stairwell. The other stairwell, the one that wasn't full of federal agents and the men they'd just arrested. He was at the door when Moss's voice came through Voss's earpiece loud enough that Mason caught it from 6 feet away. Voss's face did something. Not panic, she wasn't built for panic, but a rapid interior adjustment, a reorientation, the look of someone who had just received a data point that changed the shape of everything else. She looked at Mason. "What?" he said. "The analyst finished the second encryption layer on the drive." She paused. "The federal contact in Dre's files." Another pause. "It's not a field agent. It's not a coordinator." He waited. "It's the deputy administrator of the Ashford Ridge Regional Medical Authority," she said, "the government body that oversees hospital operations in this county." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "His name is Roland Pritchard. He has an office in this building, Mason. He's been using his position to access federal law enforcement liaison records for 2 years." She paused. "And he's scheduled to arrive for his weekly administrative walkthrough in 22 minutes. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere above them, in the room where Callum Dre was no longer lying, a monitor beeped its steady and different rhythm. "He doesn't know we know," Mason said. "Not yet. Then he's going to walk through that front door thinking it's a normal Tuesday." Voss nodded once. "Moss wants to take him at the entrance. Standard approach, badge, and detain before he gets inside." Mason looked at the corridor, at the building around him, at the specific geography of everything that had happened in the last 8 hours. "Don't," he said. Voss frowned. "Don't what?" "Don't take him at the entrance." He turned to face her fully. "He gets detained at the door, he lawyers up in the parking lot, and you get the administrative arrest but you lose the evidence chain. He's been in this system for 2 years. He knows exactly what to deny and what to discard." He paused. "But if he walks in thinking it's a normal Tuesday, and he goes to the one place in this building where he's going to want to check on something, where he's going to try to confirm whether the operation last night succeeded or failed," Voss was ahead of him. "He goes somewhere that puts him in proximity to evidence of his own involvement. He's been running interference for Galt. If Galt's people failed tonight, Pritchard is going to want to know the status of whatever Dre was carrying. He's going to reach out from inside this building, using systems he believes are protected, because he's done it 100 times before and it's always worked." Mason held her gaze. "Let him get comfortable. Let him get to a terminal. And then you have not just the arrest, you have him in the act." Voss was quiet for 3 seconds. She turned away from him and spoke into her earpiece in a low, rapid voice. Stopped, listened, turned back. "Ma says yes," she said. 22 minutes. She looked at Mason. "We need eyes on every terminal in this building." "I know where all of them are," he said. And then his phone rang. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize, a 703 area code, which was Northern Virginia, which was a very particular concentration of federal offices. And when he picked up, the voice on the other end said his name in a way that indicated the person had been waiting to say it for longer than tonight. "Reed," the voice said. "This is Commander Dale Whitford, Special Operations Command. I've been briefed on the situation at Ashford Ridge." A pause. "We need to talk about what you've been doing in that hospital for 3 years, and why you're the only reason Callum Dre is still alive, and what happens next." Another pause, and in it Mason heard something he hadn't been expecting. Not authority, not a debrief request, but something that sounded considerably more like an apology gathering itself before it spoke. "We've been looking for you, son, for longer than you know." Mason stood in the corridor of Ashford Ridge Memorial, with the gray morning pressing in through the windows and the weight of the last 8 hours in his feet and the next 22 minutes already running in his head, and he said, "I'm listening." Commander Whitford talked for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Mason listened to all of it without interrupting, which was something Whitford apparently hadn't expected, because when Mason said nothing immediately after the silence fell, Whitford said, "You still there?" "Still here." "I know there's a lot in that." "There is." Mason was walking slowly toward the window at the end of the ground floor corridor, not from any particular destination, but because standing still when his mind was moving felt like a mismatch. "You said you've been looking for me. What does that mean, specifically?" A pause from the Northern Virginia end of the line. "When you separated, there was an internal review of the 2019 operation. The overseas component closed clean. The domestic thread didn't. We spent 14 months trying to build enough to move on the stateside network. That's Callum Dre's assignment. And somewhere in that process, we started pulling records on everyone who touched the original operation." Another pause. "Your name came up in ways that made people want to find you, not for accountability, for the opposite. You needed a witness, among other things." Whitford's voice had the weight of someone who'd had this conversation many times in his head and was finding the real version harder than the rehearsed one. "Reed, the people you helped take apart in 2019, the overseas financial coordinator, his network. They had domestic partners who've been operating for years since then. Dre's been documenting it. But there are gaps in the evidence chain that you could close. Things you saw on the ground that were never formally recorded because the mission parameters didn't include that level of documentation. Things I saw that would hold up in a federal proceeding. Yes. Mason looked out the window at the parking lot. The morning had arrived properly now, gray and wet, the kind of Tuesday that had no idea what had happened inside this building while it was becoming itself. Early staff were arriving, umbrellas up, coffee in hand, walking toward the entrance with the particular obliviousness of people whose night had been ordinary. "Commander," Mason said, "I have something more immediate right now." Voss briefed me. "Pritchard. He's arriving in—" Mason checked the clock on the wall. 18 minutes. I need to get off this call." "Understood. Read." A pause that carried something heavier than what came before it. "What you've done tonight. What you've been doing, apparently, for 3 years in that hospital. It's going to matter. I want you to know that before you go back in there." Mason said, "I'll call you when this is done," and ended the call and put the phone in his pocket and stood at the window for exactly 5 more seconds. Then he went to find Moss. They set it up in 17 minutes, which was not enough time and was all the time they had. The plan was simple in structure and genuinely unpleasant in execution, the way the right plans usually were. Roland Pritchard made a weekly administrative walkthrough of Ashford Ridge Memorial every Tuesday at 8 a.m. He had done this for 3 years. He had an access badge to every floor, a standing arrangement with the front desk, and a regular habit of stopping in the administrative suite on the second floor to review compliance documentation and use the secure terminal there, a terminal that connected to the Regional Medical Authority's database, which in turn had liaison access to several federal reporting systems. That terminal had been the quiet mechanism of 2 years of interference, permit approvals routed away from scrutiny, complaint files that never reached the right desks, names run through systems that shouldn't have been queried. Moss put Voss in the administrative suite 30 seconds after the plan was agreed. He put Pelletier at the stairwell nearest the suite entrance. He coordinated with the local PD unit, 2 officers, plainclothes, who'd been on the hospital perimeter since 4 a.m., to take positions in the first-floor lobby that looked like nothing in particular. Mason's role in the plan was technically to stay out of it. He understood the reasoning. He wasn't federal, he wasn't law enforcement. He was a dismissed floor nurse with a classified military background who had been operating in a gray area since approximately 11 p.m. the previous evening, and putting him in a room where a federal arrest was being executed would create chain of custody complications that Moss's case didn't need. I understood all of that, and he also understood that he knew this building and these people and these corridors in a way that Moss's team did not, and those 2 things existed simultaneously without resolving neatly. He stayed on the second floor, not in the administrative suite. In the corridor outside the supply room 40 feet away, which gave him a sight line to the suite entrance and the elevator bank and the secondary stairwell, and which was a place where a nurse standing with a tablet looked like a nurse standing with a tablet. Tasha walked past him at 7:58 and said, "You look like you're trying to see through walls." "I'm reviewing charts." She looked at the tablet, which was showing a supply inventory screen because it was the first thing that had loaded when he picked it up. "That's the linen count. Very important linen count." She gave him a look that said she had decided this was not a battle worth having and kept walking. At 8:03, the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened and Roland Pritchard stepped out. Mason had pulled his file from the hospital's public directory in the 12 minutes between the plan being set and now. Administrative photo, 3 years old. The man in the photo was 61, silver-haired, the kind of solid institutional build that came from spending decades in rooms where decisions got made and appetites got fed. He wore the careful authority of someone who had learned that the best way to hold power was to look like you were merely managing it on behalf of others. The man who came off the elevator was older than the photo and slightly less composed, though you'd have to know what composed looked like on him to notice the difference. I was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a tie, which was more than the photo suggested he usually bothered with on Tuesdays. The tie was the tell. People dressed up when they were nervous. They reached for formality when the ground was less stable than usual, because formality was a structure you could inhabit when other structures were uncertain. He walked down the corridor toward the administrative suite, past the supply room doorway without looking at Mason. Mason watched him pass. Pritchard stopped at the administrative suite door, ran his badge, and went inside. Mason counted to 12. Then he texted Moss a single character, a period, which was what they'd agreed to use for in position. Moss's response came back in 4 seconds. The same thing. The next 23 minutes were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where everything was already in motion and your role was to be available and not needed. Mason had run operations on both sides of this dynamic and had never found a version of it that felt comfortable. The brain wanted to be useful. The brain ran scenarios. The brain found 17 ways things could go wrong and cataloged them with unhelpful thoroughness. He stood in the corridor and reviewed the actual linen count and made himself breathe at a rate that was consistent with a person who was reviewing a linen count. At 8:11, he heard the specific silence that comes when a room that had ambient noise suddenly stops producing it. At 8:12, Voss's voice came through Pelletier's earpiece. Mason was close enough to hear it, thin and clear. "He's at the terminal." At 8:19, a different quality of silence, the kind that precedes movement. At 8:21, the administrative suite door opened and Donna Hartwell came out first, moving quickly, her face the face of someone who had just been told something while standing in a room where something else was happening and hadn't fully reconciled the two. She nearly walked into Mason. She stopped, looked at him. "They said to get the director out," she said, and her voice was flat and thin. "They said to get out of the room." "That's right. They're saying he's been using the terminal to..." She stopped. Her hand went to her mouth briefly, came back down. "I signed his access renewal last year. He needed the badge level for the compliance reviews. I approved it." "You didn't know?" "I signed it." "Director." He said it the way he'd said her name at 2 in the morning in a different corridor, the same quality of directness without cruelty. "You couldn't have known from the access request. That's how it was designed." She looked at him for a moment, not looking for absolution, he didn't think, but for the truth of whether she'd been complicit without knowing it. He held her gaze and let her find what she found there. The suite door opened again, and Voss came out, followed by Pelletier, and between them was Roland Prichard with his hands zip-tied in front of him and his leather portfolio still tucked under his arm because nobody had thought to take it yet, which gave him the surreal quality of a man who had been arrested on his way to a meeting he hadn't finished preparing for. He looked at the corridor, at Hartwell, at the 2 plainclothes officers who had appeared from the stairwell. His face moved through several things in quick succession: calculation, assessment, the beginning of something that might have been a prepared statement, and then his eyes landed on Mason. He didn't recognize Mason, that was clear. He looked at Mason the way he'd have looked at any floor nurse standing in the corridor of a hospital he walked through every week, briefly, dismissively, the look that said, "Not relevant, skip." That look, Mason thought, was the whole story. "I want to speak to my attorney," Prichard said. His voice was steady, practiced, the voice of a man who'd kept his composure through difficult rooms before and believed he could do it again. "You'll have that opportunity," Voss said. She was already moving him toward the elevator. Prichard looked at Hartwell as he passed her. Something shifted in his expression. "Donna, I want you to know that whatever they've told you, the authorities' interests were always..." "Don't," Hartwell said. Just that word, and the steadiness in her voice surprised Mason. He thought it surprised her too. Prichard went into the elevator. The doors closed. Hartwell stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the closed elevator doors, and then she sat down on the bench that was there for patients' families and put her hands in her lap and stared at the floor. Mason sat beside her, not because she asked, just because she was there, and the corridor was suddenly very empty. 2 years, she said. He's been in this building every Tuesday for 3 years. 2 of them he was... What? What was he doing exactly? Interfering with oversight, rerouting complaint filings, running names for a criminal network. He kept his voice level. Nothing he did directly harmed patients here. His role was administrative interference, not clinical. That you know of. He paused. That we know of so far. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. How reassuring. They sat for a moment in the institutional quiet of a second-floor corridor at 8:30 in the morning. "Mason," she said. It was the second time she'd used his first name. "What you did last night. What you've apparently been. Who you..." She stopped, gathered it. "Why did you stay? When I told you to leave? When I said those things in front of everyone, why come back?" He thought about the scanner. The call coming through at 11:40. The patient in the crash on Route 7. Because someone needed to, he said. It was the truest answer and also the least satisfying one, and he knew that, and he gave it anyway because it was what he had. By 9 a.m., the third floor had become something else entirely. Commander Whitford had arranged for a secure federal mobile unit to be set up in the hospital's conference room, a van with equipment that Mason recognized from another life, a different context, and which was now interfacing with the drive that Dre had sewn into his jacket lining and carried out of a controlled situation at considerable personal cost. The analyst on Whitford's team, a woman named Farker, who communicated entirely in clipped declarative sentences and appeared to have no opinion about being inside a Tennessee hospital at 9 on a Tuesday morning, had the drive fully cracked by 9:17 and began running the contents against 3 active federal cases simultaneously. Mason stood outside the conference room and watched this through the glass panel in the door. Not because anyone had invited him in, but because he'd been part of making it possible and he wanted to see the thing fully exist. Voss found him there at 9:34. Pritchard is at the federal building in Knoxville, she said. He asked for his attorney twice on the way there. His attorney apparently already knew something was wrong because Pritchard called him at 6 this morning, which is interesting given that we didn't execute the arrest until 8:20. He made a call at 6, Mason said, from his personal cell, which we didn't have a warrant on at 6. We do now. She crossed her arms. Our analyst found 2 outgoing messages from the secure terminal before we moved on him, both encrypted, both sent between 8:19 and 8:21. He knew something was wrong. He was trying to warn someone. Did they go through? The encryption flagged our monitoring system before they completed transmission. We cut the terminal access at 8:20. They went partial. She looked at Mason. Partial is interesting. Partial means someone received something but not the full message, which means they know something happened but not what. Mason thought about that. Galt. Possibly Galt directly. Possibly someone between them. Whoever it is, they received a truncated alert from their inside source, and now their inside source isn't answering. She paused. That's a panicked person, making panicked decisions. Panicked people make mistakes. Yes. She said it with the particular flatness of someone who had spent a career watching that principle prove true in ways that were rarely clean. Whitford wants to use the evidence on the drive to execute a warrant on the Galt property by end of day. The tactical team that was en route has been redirected to staging area 3 miles out. She looked at him. He also wants to talk to you again, not on the phone, in person. Whitford is coming here? He's already in the air. She checked her watch. Lands in 40 minutes. Mason absorbed this. Dre? Extubated at 9:10. He's weak but lucid. Ferris says the chest is holding. No reaccumulation. She paused. He's been asking for you. Mason looked at the conference room glass, at the analyst working the drive, at the data that Callum Dre had spent 14 months building and had physically carried out of a dangerous place and had apparently kept asking about from inside sedation until someone told him it was safe. Tell Ferris I'm coming up, he said. Well, Dre looked considerably worse now that he was conscious, and the sedation had worn off, which was medically correct. Awareness is less forgiving than under. But he also looked like himself in a way that unconscious people don't. He had eyes that had seen a specific kind of thing for a long time and had decided to keep going anyway. And those eyes tracked Mason from the doorway to the chair beside the bed with a directness that was slightly exhausting. You're the nurse, Dre said. His voice was rough from the tube but functional. Reed, Mason Reed. They told me you held the room. He paused to breathe, carefully, the way people breathe when breathing is currently a project. From the time I came in. You were alone in a room with a credential that mattered. Seemed like the right thing to do. Dre looked at him for a moment. Whitford called you. He did? He tell you about the 2019 operation? Enough. Another careful breath. I pulled your files 6 months ago, when I was building the domestic network map. The overseas coordinator you helped take down, Renata Voss. Not related to Agent Voss, Mason said. No, but Renata Voss's domestic partners include Warren Galt. Include 2 county officials in Harlan County who've since been replaced, but whose replacements were influenced. Include Roland Pritchard, who started his arrangement with Galt 3 months after the overseas network went down. When Galt realized he needed better institutional cover. Dre paused. His jaw tightened briefly. You were at the start of this chain and you didn't know it. I know it now. The evidence on that drive, your testimony about the 2019 mission, the tactical documentation you could provide about the target and the network structure. It closes a gap in 3 federal cases that we haven't been able to close. He looked at Mason steadily. I need to know if you're willing to do that. Provide testimony. Full debrief? Probably multiple sessions. It'll take what you've spent 3 years keeping quiet and put it in a formal record. Mason looked at the window, at the morning outside it, at the gray Tennessee sky that was finally, tentatively, starting to show something lighter at the edges. He thought about why he'd come to Ashford Ridge. He thought about what he'd been trying to find in the double shifts and the quiet and the ordinary mechanics of keeping people's bodies working. He thought about Mrs. Okafor and her potassium levels and the linen count and the cold coffee in the cup holder of his truck. Yes, he said. Dre nodded once. Something in his face settled. Get some rest, Mason said. You look like you've been undercover for 14 months. Dre made a sound that took a moment to identify as a laugh. Whitford landed at 10:55 and was at the hospital by 11:20, which meant someone had driven him fast from the regional airstrip, which meant he was the kind of commander who communicated urgency through logistics rather than language. He was a compact man in his mid-60s, gray-haired, with the spare economy of movement that Mason associated with people who had spent years in environments where unnecessary motion was a liability. He shook Mason's hand in the second-floor corridor with the specific grip of someone who'd been thinking about this meeting. You look terrible, Whitford said. I've been awake since yesterday morning. I know. Come with me. They used the family consultation room again. Whitford closed the door. He looked at Mason across the table in the same way Moss had, but differently. Moss had been assessing, calculating. Whitford was looking at him the way you look at something you lost and found again and aren't sure yet whether it's intact. Your separation, Whitford said, 3 years ago. I want to talk about how that happened. Mason had not expected this to be the opening. He'd expected operational debrief, procedural setup, the clinical mechanics of testimony and case structure. He adjusted. What do you want to know? The review board. The medical separation. The reason on file is a... Whitford paused. A determination that your psychological profile was inconsistent with continued active deployment. That's what the file says. I've read the full file now. I didn't have full access at the time. Reed, what happened in that review process was... He stopped, pressed his mouth flat. It wasn't handled correctly. The evaluating officer had a relationship with someone in the chain of command who wanted your unit restructured, and the evaluations were, he chose the word carefully, shaped to reach a particular outcome. The fluorescent light in the consultation room buzzed. It was going to do that until maintenance fixed it, and maintenance wasn't going to fix it today. I know, Mason said. Whitford looked at him. You knew. I suspected. At the time, I didn't have enough to challenge it, and I was tired. He said the last part without drama. 3 years ago, I was genuinely very tired, and I didn't have the energy to fight a process that was designed to exhaust the person fighting it. So I signed the papers and drove to Tennessee. I'm sorry, Whitford said, for what that process was. Mason looked at him. He let the words land and settle and be what they were, imperfect and necessary and real. I appreciate that, he said, and he meant it. At 1:30 in the afternoon, federal agents and the tactical team executed a search warrant on the Galt property 6 miles from the crash site on Route 7. Mason wasn't there. He was in the hospital cafeteria eating the first actual meal he'd had since the previous afternoon. Something described on the menu as a chicken wrap that had a complex relationship with that description. When Voss texted him a single line, Galt in custody. Property secured. Evidence exceeds warrant parameters. He read it twice, set his phone down, ate the rest of the wrap. What the text didn't say, and what Voss filled in when she called 20 minutes later, was that the Galt property had contained documentation of 3 years of operational records, transport logs, payment structures, personnel records covering people in 4 states, and that in a locked secondary structure on the property, they had found physical evidence directly connecting Galt's network to 7 open missing persons cases across Tennessee and Kentucky. 7, Mason said. 7 confirmed. Forensics is still working. Her voice was careful and controlled, and underneath both of those things was something that had weight. Dre's documentation gives us names, dates, transaction records. The property gives us physical corroboration. With Pritchard's communications trail and your testimony from the 2019 operation, the federal attorney's office in Knoxville says they have enough to move on this at every level. Mason stared at the table. Reed. I'm here. This is what Dre did for 14 months, what he brought out of there. It's going to matter to real people, the cases that get reopened. She paused. And what you did last night kept all of it from being buried. He didn't say anything to that. Get some sleep, she said. Whitford wants you in Knoxville tomorrow morning. Debrief starts at 9. She ended the call. The cafeteria was doing its lunchtime business around him. Trays, conversations, the ordinary percussion of a building full of people who'd had a regular Tuesday. He sat in it for a while. Tasha appeared with a tray and sat across from him without asking. You look like someone ran you through a washing machine, she said. That's accurate. The whole hospital is talking. Not everything. Nobody knows the details. But people know something happened. The federal agents. The arrests. She set her fork down. Hartwell told the morning charge nurses that last night required the response it got because of the actions of an off-duty staff member who stayed when he didn't have to. She said that? In those exact words. Tasha was quiet for a moment. She also put a note in your file. Positive addendum. I know because she told me and said I could tell you. Mason looked at his tray. At the window behind Tasha where the afternoon had arrived and the rain had finally fully stopped. I'll be back in a few days, he said, after the debrief in Knoxville. Are you coming back here? To the floor? He honestly didn't know the answer to that. It wasn't that he didn't want to. It was that the shape of things had shifted in the last 15 hours in ways he hadn't finished processing, and claiming to know what came next would be premature. I'm going to get through Knoxville first, he said. Tasha nodded. She didn't push it. He finished his food. It was bad. He didn't care. I was standing in the elevator on the way back up to the 3rd floor to check on Dre, because that was what he was doing next. It was the next right thing. When the elevator stopped on the 2nd floor and Donna Hartwell stepped in, they rode up to 3 together. She looked straight ahead at the elevator doors. He looked at the floor numbers changing. I've been going over the personnel files, she said. The formal performance review I mentioned last night. I'm closing it, with a note of my own. You don't have to do that. I'm aware. A pause. I also called Human Resources about the 2 previous charge position openings that you didn't apply for. She paused again, differently. Why didn't you apply? He thought about it. I wasn't sure I was going to stay. Are you sure now? The elevator stopped at 3. The doors opened. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment in the way that sometimes holds the most. Ask me again in a week, he said, and walked out. He was halfway down the corridor to Dre's room when his phone rang again. The 703 number, Whitford. But when he picked up, the voice wasn't Whitford's. It was a woman's voice, measured and precise, with the particular cadence of someone who had spent years selecting words with care and had learned to pack a great deal into a small space. Mr. Reed, she said. My name is Aldridge. Assistant Director Carla Aldridge, Federal Joint Task Force on Domestic Trafficking Networks. A pause. I've been briefed on everything that's happened in the last 12 hours. The evidence from the Galt property, Dre's documentation, Pritchard's communications trail. Another pause. And you? Mason stood in the corridor outside Dre's room. I'm listening, he said. We have a situation, Aldridge said. Pritchard's partial message, the one that transmitted before your team cut the terminal. Our forensics team reconstructed it 30 minutes ago. A pause that carried weight. The message didn't go to Galt. It went to someone else. Someone we don't have a file on yet, who has been operating above Galt's level, coordinating the network across state lines, managing the institutional contacts, and who, as of this morning, knows that Pritchard has been arrested. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. And who knows your name, Mason? Not just from the system poll last night, from the 2019 operation. This person has been tracking the domestic thread of that case since before Dre went undercover, since before we knew there was a domestic thread. She paused. Which means they've been watching this longer than we have, and now they're running. Outside this corridor window, the afternoon sat in flat and clear, the kind of light that comes after rain and makes everything look temporary. Where? Mason said. That's what I'm calling to tell you, Aldridge said. Because 30 minutes ago, this person used a credential to access the Ashford Ridge Regional Medical Authority's administrative server, not remotely. Her voice was very steady. From inside this building. Mason didn't move for 2 full seconds. 2 seconds was a long time when the information arriving was the kind that rearranged everything. Inside this building, he said. The access timestamp is 1:47 p.m., Aldridge said. 11 minutes ago. The server query pulled administrative staff rosters, facility access logs, and visitor registration for the last 72 hours. She paused. Whoever this is, they're not running. They're consolidating. They want to know what we have and who's been in this building. They want to know if they're in the records. Yes. And they're doing it from inside, which means they either have a legitimate reason to be here or they have credentials that make them look like they do. A pause. Mason, I need you to think about everyone you've seen in this building in the last 2 hours. Anyone who arrived after the Galt warrant executed. Anyone who doesn't fully belong. He was already running it. The cafeteria, the corridor, the elevator, Tasha, Hartwell, the morning staff coming on, the families of patients, filtered through the front desk, nothing out of... He stopped. The visitor log. Dre's room. They'd restricted access, but the official visitor registration at the front desk was still a functional system, still running, and it connected to the administrative server in a way that any competent person with the right credentials could leverage as a lateral entry point. He thought about who had come to that desk. He thought about Devin, who'd come at 5:40 a.m. and was now in federal custody. He thought about who might have come after, quietly, legitimately. During the morning shift change when the lobby was full of people, and a new face at the registration desk looked like a visitor and not an intrusion. The visitor log from 8 to 10 a.m., he said. Pull it. He heard keyboard sounds from Aldridge's end. A pause. 14 registered visitors during that window, cross-referencing now against... She stopped. A different quality of silence. One name flags against a secondary identity in our system. A woman named Darlene Pruitt, listed as the aunt of a patient in room 214. Room 214 is occupied by a 67-year-old man admitted for hip replacement surgery. His emergency contact list has no one named Pruitt. She's still in the building? She signed in. There's no sign-out recorded. Mason was already moving. What does she look like? The registration photo. We don't have... Wait. The front desk uses an ID scanner for visitor badges. Give me... Typing. 43 years old, dark hair, medium build. She presented a Tennessee driver's license. And the secondary identity in your system, what's the flag? It's a name we found in Dre's documentation, not as a principal, as a coordinator. Someone who moved between operational cells managing logistics and personnel. She appears in 3 entries, always as a point of contact between Galt's level and something above it. Aldridge's voice tightened slightly. If she's here and she accessed the server, she's not just logistics. She's decision-making. Mason was in the stairwell going down. Lock the building. Nobody in or out until you have people on every exit. I've already contacted Moss. He's on the ground floor. Tell him east exit first. The broken lock on the side entrance. It works both ways. Someone who knows about it as an entry point knows it as an exit. He hit the ground floor landing. I'm in the building. I'm looking. He came through the stairwell door into the ground floor corridor and stopped. Stood still. Let the building be what it was around him. The sounds of it, the movement patterns, the particular rhythm of a hospital at early afternoon. Carts. Voices at a distance. The elevator bank to his left. The main lobby ahead. He thought about where a person went in a hospital when they needed to be somewhere without being noticed. Not patient floors. Too many staff. Too much structure. Not the administrative suite. Not after Pritchard's arrest had federal agents in that corridor. Not the lobby. Too visible. Auxiliary spaces. The places that existed between the functional areas. Waiting rooms that saw light traffic at this hour. The family chapel, which Mason had never once seen anyone use. The lower level with the physical therapy department that ran a reduced schedule on Tuesdays. The radiology suite's secondary waiting area, which had a service door that connected to the loading dock. The loading dock, which was an exit that didn't go through the front desk or the ambulance bay, which had a door that was propped open during delivery hours, and which delivery hours on Tuesday ran until 2 p.m. He was moving before he finished the thought. He took the corridor that ran along the building's north face, past the dietary department, past the housekeeping storage alcove that smelled permanently of industrial cleaner, and he moved fast and quiet, the way he'd learned to move a long time ago, in places that had a great deal more at stake than a hospital corridor, and which had somehow led, through a route he still didn't fully understand, to this exact building and this exact moment. The loading dock anteroom was a 15 by 20 space with a commercial scale, a supply cart, and two folding chairs that looked like they'd been there since the building opened. The outer door to the dock was propped with a rubber wedge. Beyond it, the dock itself was concrete, covered, open at the far end to the parking service road. The woman was standing near the outer door with her back to the room, a phone to her ear, a visitor badge clipped to her jacket. She heard him. She turned. They looked at each other across the anteroom. She was a composed face. Not panicked, not yet. The face of someone who had spent years being the person in the background and had survived that long by reading rooms correctly. She was reading this one now. She saw Mason in scrubs. She saw no badge, no weapon, no uniform. She made the same calculation Donna Hartwell had made 9 hours ago, the same calculation Devon had made at the consultation room doorway. She started moving toward the outer door. "Prewitt," Mason said. She stopped. Not because the name startled her, she'd used that name herself this morning. She stopped because of how he said it. The same flat, complete certainty she'd heard in no one else's voice today, which meant she was recalculating. "I don't know who you are," she said. Calm, measured, buying time the way people do when they're still looking for the exit. "You accessed the administrative server at 1:47, Mason said. "You queried the visitor log, the facility access records, and the staff roster. You were trying to find out what Pritchard managed to transmit before the terminal was cut." He moved one step to the left, slowly, not aggressive, just positioning. "He didn't transmit much, but he transmitted your name." That landed. He saw it land. The specific tightening around her eyes that meant the variable she'd been holding as uncertain had just resolved, and it had resolved badly. "Whatever you think you know." "I don't think anything," Mason said. "I know that Callum Dre spent 14 months documenting your network. I know that the Galt property is currently being processed by a federal forensics team. I know that Pritchard is in federal custody in Knoxville, and that the partial message he sent went to an account that your secondary identity is linked to." He took another slow step, positioned himself between her and the outer door without making it look deliberate. "I know that every exit from this building has a federal agent or a local officer on it, except the one you're standing in front of." She looked at the door behind her, at Mason, at the door. "And you," she said carefully, "are a nurse." "I'm a lot of things," Mason said. "Right now I'm the person who's going to ask you to sit down on that chair while I make a phone call." She moved, not toward the chair, toward him and the door behind him, because she'd made the calculation that he was one person without a visible weapon and the door behind him was the better exit, and she was fast, genuinely fast, with the compact decisiveness of someone who'd made physical decisions in pressured moments before. Mason sidestepped, put his left hand on her wrist and used her own momentum the way you use a current. Not against it, with it, redirecting. A controlled movement that took her forward motion and turned it into a controlled descent to the floor. She went down on her hands and knees, and Mason was above her with a hand on her shoulder. Not hard, not cruel, just present, just there. "Don't," he said. The same word he'd used in the stairwell at 5 in the morning. He seemed to keep needing it. She stayed on the floor. Her breathing was audible and rapid. Her hands, flat on the concrete, were still. The outer door opened from the dock side, and Moss came through it with 2 officers behind him, and he took in the scene with the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by Mason Reed approximately 6 hours ago. "She's secure," Mason said. He stepped back and let the officers handle it. Moss looked at him. "You got here before us." "I had context." "You keep having context." Moss crouched down and looked at the woman on the floor as the officers brought her to her feet. "Darlene Prewitt, or whatever your name actually is." He stood. "We're going to have a long conversation." She looked at him with the residual composure of someone who still believed there was a version of this where she came out the other side, and Mason watched her face and saw the exact moment that belief ran out. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a quiet interior extinction, a light going off behind the eyes. And then she was just a person in federal custody in a hospital loading dock on a Tuesday afternoon, which was what she was. By 3 p.m., the building had been cleared, confirmed, and gradually returned to the rhythm it was supposed to have. Federal agents packed equipment. Local PD units stood down from perimeter positions. The second-floor administrative suite, which had hosted an arrest and a substantial quantity of federal activity since morning, was locked pending a formal review of the server access logs, which was fine because nobody in hospital administration was going to need those terminals today and possibly not this week. Mason sat in the family consultation room at 3:15 and did not move for approximately 12 minutes. Not from exhaustion, though that was present and real, from something else. The particular stillness that comes after a long, sustained effort, when the effort is finally done, and the body and mind don't yet know what to do with the absence of pressure. Whitford found him there. He came in and closed the door and sat across from Mason and didn't say anything for a moment, and Mason appreciated that more than he could have said. "It's done," Whitford said finally. "All 4 primary subjects in custody. Prewitt is going to be the most significant charge. She's the linchpin between Galt's operational level and the network structure above it. Aldridge thinks she'll negotiate eventually. They always do when they understand what the evidence looks like." The 7 missing persons cases. "The investigation expands as of today. We'll have a formal task force announced by end of week. The families—" He stopped, pressed his mouth flat. "The families have been waiting for a long time on some of these. We can at least start giving them answers." Mason looked at the table. "That started with Dre going under 14 months ago," Whitford said. "And it ended with you being in this building last night." He paused. "I want to say that plainly. The chain holds because both of those things were true. Dre did the heavy work. Dre couldn't have gotten out with that drive if you hadn't kept him stable and kept the room clean and kept 2 of Galt's contractors from reaching him at 5 in the morning." Whitford looked at him steadily. "You were the right person in the right place." "I was a dismissed floor nurse in the parking lot of a hospital where I'd just been called mediocre." "Yes," Whitford said. "You were, and you came back anyway." The fluorescent light buzzed. It was going to keep doing that. "The debrief," Mason said. "Knoxville, 9 a.m. Still on, but there's something else I want to put on the table first." Whitford leaned forward. "The separation review. The board evaluation 3 years ago that closed your career. I've spent the last 6 hours with the Inspector General's office and with the officer who conducted that evaluation. The evaluation was compromised. The record is going to be formally corrected, and I want you to know that before you sit down in a debrief room tomorrow and give testimony that's going to matter to a federal case." Mason looked at him. "Your record," Whitford said, "will reflect 18 years of honorable service and a separation that was procedurally invalid. That's the true record. The one that existed before someone with an agenda decided to manage your exit." There was a sound somewhere in the building, a cart in a corridor, something ordinary, the hospital doing what hospitals do. Mason sat with the words and let them be real without rushing them. "I'm not asking you to come back to active duty," Whitford continued. "I'm not in a position to make that offer, and I don't think it's what you want. What I'm saying is that what happened to you 3 years ago was wrong, and you're owed the truth of that in writing, and you're going to have it." Mason nodded. He didn't trust himself to say something that wouldn't sound like too much or too little, so he nodded, and Whitford, who was good at reading rooms, accepted that. "Get some rest tonight," Whitford said. "Knoxville tomorrow." He left, and Mason sat in the consultation room alone, and the light buzzed, and the building went on around him, and he stayed there for a while longer because there was no reason to rush, and the sitting was fine. He checked on Dre at 4. Dre was sitting up. Not comfortably. The chest wasn't going to be comfortable for several weeks, and the bruising from the intubation attempts had settled into his throat in a way that made his voice sound like gravel. But sitting up and present, which was its own kind of remarkable given that he'd been crashing in a trauma bay 12 hours ago. "They told me about Prewitt," Dre said when Mason came in. "She's in custody. She was running coordination for 2 years, maybe longer. I suspected her in the documentation, but I didn't have a direct confirmation." His jaw tightened. "She was the reason 3 of my reports went sideways. Tip-offs that moved the wrong people before we could move on them." He looked at Mason. "If she'd gotten out of this building with a clear picture of what we have, she didn't." "No." He was quiet for a moment. Because you were in a loading dock. Because Aldridge pulled the visitor log. Because you told her to. Dre looked at him with those eyes that had seen what they'd seen and kept going. Reed, I've been doing this work for 14 months, and I need you to understand something. He paused, gathered his rough voice. The thing that breaks these networks isn't always the big operation. It's not always the tactical team or the warrant execution. Sometimes it's one person who sees something that doesn't add up and decides that matters, who stays in a room when they don't have to, who makes the right call in a loading dock at 3 in the afternoon. He stopped, breathed. You did that. Start to finish, last night and today. You did that. Mason looked at the window, at the afternoon that was getting on toward evening now, the light changing. You did 14 months undercover in a trafficking network, Mason said. I think perspective is a complicated thing. Dre made the gravel laugh sound again. It clearly hurt him, and he did it anyway. Get some rest, Mason said. Same thing he'd said this morning. You actually need it. You've been awake since yesterday. I'm going to fix that shortly. He left the room. In the corridor outside, Pelletier was no longer on the door. Dre was secure, the threat was contained, and the federal security posture had shifted from active defense to documentation and processing. The corridor was just a corridor again. Third floor of a hospital in Tennessee, late Tuesday afternoon, the ordinary things that corridors contained. Mason took the stairs down. Hartwell was in her office on the second floor. The door was open, which he'd never seen before, so she was a closed-door administrator, the kind who maintained the visual boundary of authority as a matter of practice. The open door felt like something. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. I'm heading out, he said. She stood. She was doing the careful, deliberate thing with her hands that people do when they're preparing to say something and want it to come out right. I want to say something, she said, and I want to say it correctly, so bear with me if it comes out a little stiff. He waited. What I said to you last night in the corridor in front of staff, that was wrong. Not just inaccurate, wrong. She met his eyes. I looked at a file and I looked at a man who was quiet and didn't perform and didn't lobby for himself, and I decided that quiet meant empty. I've been in this field for 26 years, and I made the most elementary mistake there is, which is confusing visibility with value. She paused. You saved 3 patients on that floor last night before any of the federal situation started. Mrs. Okafor, the man in Bay 3, the patient you caught in Bay 9 with altered mental status that Ferris had written off as anxiety. The morning team found an early-stage bleed on his imaging. He's in surgery right now, and they believe he'll be fine. She stopped. You did that while being told to leave. Mason stood in the doorway. I put a formal commendation in your file this morning, she said. And I called the hospital board at noon to inform them that a staff member had displayed extraordinary conduct over the past 16 hours and that I was requesting his active reinstatement with a review of compensation grade. She squared her shoulders, a small, precise movement. They approved it before 2 p.m. The afternoon light came through the window behind her desk. It caught the dust in the air and made it visible, which was what light did when it came in at the right angle. Director, Mason said. I appreciate that, genuinely. But? She heard something in his voice. Not a but. I'm going to Knoxville tomorrow. Federal debrief, possibly several days. When I get back... He paused. When I get back, I'd like to have a conversation about what the floor needs and where I actually fit. Not what the grade level says. What the work actually needs. She considered him. That sounds like a man who's thinking about something. I've been thinking about a lot of things since about midnight. She nodded slowly. When you get back, she said. My door is... She looked at the open door. Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a different kind of person than she'd been yesterday. My door is open. He left. He drove home at 5:30. The same route he drove every night after a shift, the same turns, the same stretch of highway, where the tree line opened up and you could see the ridge for a moment before the road curved back in. The sky was doing something remarkable with the post-rain light, going orange and deep pink at the horizon in a way that was almost aggressive about how beautiful it was. And Mason drove through it without trying to make it mean anything, and it was fine anyway. Grady was on his porch next door when Mason pulled into his driveway. Grady was 68, retired from the county roads department, and had the particular porch-sitting energy of a man who had decided that watching the day end was a complete activity that required no justification. "Rough shift?" Grady called over. "Somewhat extended. You look like something the cat found." That's been the general consensus. Mason stood by his truck for a moment, not quite ready to go inside yet. "You still want to watch something Thursday?" Grady squinted at him. "You going to be conscious Thursday? Working on it?" "Then yeah," Grady said. "Thursday. I'll get the good chips." Mason went inside. His apartment was the same. That was the thing about the external world. It kept being the same while you were out having a night that changed the shape of things. The same counter, the same chair, the same books stacked on the side table in the order he'd left them. It smelled like coffee and the particular staleness of a place that had been empty for 30-plus hours. And it was his, and it was quiet, and he stood in the middle of it for a moment, just letting it be around him. He picked up his phone and called his sister. She picked up on the second ring. "You never called me back," she said, which was her standard opening when he'd been slow. "I know. I had a night." "What kind of night?" He sat down in the chair. "A long one. I'll tell you about it sometime." He paused. "How are you?" She heard something in his voice, the way sisters do, and she shifted gears without making it a thing. "I'm okay. Marcus's school play is Friday. He's a tree." "A tree?" "A very important tree, apparently. He has 2 lines." "I want to hear how it goes." A pause. Soft, careful. "You okay, Mason?" "Yeah," he said. And it was true, more than it had been in a while. Not in a resolved, tidy way. There were things to process that were going to take time, testimony to give, a record to correct, patience to go back to. A conversation with Hartwell that hadn't happened yet, and a question about what came next that he hadn't answered. But okay in the way that means the ground is underneath you and holding. "I'm okay." "Good," she said. "Call me when you're not running on fumes." "Thursday," he said. "I'll call Thursday." He slept for 11 hours. The federal debrief in Knoxville took 3 days. Mason sat across tables from federal attorneys and investigators and gave testimony about things he'd carried in silence for 3 years. Not because he'd been hiding them, there had simply been no one to give them to, no proceeding that required them, no case that was open enough to receive what he knew. Now there was. He talked about the 2019 mission and what he'd seen and what he'd done and what the target's network had looked like from the ground level of a direct action medical role. He talked about specific details that confirmed specific entries in Dre's 14 months of documentation. He talked until the attorneys had what they needed. And then he answered follow-up questions. And then there were more questions. And he answered those too. It was not clean. Testimony never is. There were things he had to say that he didn't enjoy saying. There were moments when the weight of the 2019 operation came back fully, not as trauma, exactly, but as the specific gravity of actions that had mattered, that had affected real people's lives and deaths, and which now existed in a formal record and would be used to affect more. He sat with that weight. He didn't pretend it wasn't there, and he didn't perform suffering about it. He just did the work. On the 3rd day, Aldridge came in at the end of the session and sat across from him with a folder. "The pre-wit negotiation moved faster than we expected," she said. "She's agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge on 2 of the 4 counts." She opened the folder. "What she's giving us closes the network at every level we've identified. Names, account structures, operational timelines. The task force announced yesterday, 5 jurisdictions, 3 federal agencies. This is the evidence package that makes it actionable." She looked at him. 7 missing persons cases become active investigations starting Monday. 3 of them, based on Prewitt's testimony, have a strong likelihood of recovery outcomes. Mason looked at the table. 3 people, he said, at minimum. Possibly more as the investigation develops. She paused. "I'm telling you this because you're part of why that's true." He nodded. He didn't have words that felt equal to the information, so he nodded and let it sit. On the 4th day, he drove back to Ashford Ridge. The hospital was the same hospital. That was also, always, the thing. The corridors were the same corridors. The elevator still sat for 37 seconds. The fluorescent light on the 2nd floor still buzzed. though someone had apparently put in a maintenance request that was more recent than 6 weeks ago because there was a stepladder under it and a note on the wall that said Work Order Merbert 40471, in progress. In progress. That was honest. He ran into Tasha at the nursing station at the start of the 7 a.m. shift. She looked at him for a moment, taking inventory the way she did, and said, "You look like a person again." "High praise. Around here it is." She pushed a tablet toward him. "Bay 4 has a new admit, possible appendix. Ferris wants labs and a pain assessment before he comes down." Mason took the tablet. He was 3 steps toward Bay 4 when she said, "Mason." He turned. "For what it's worth," she said, and stopped and started again. "When Hartwell said what she said last week, I should have said something. I didn't, and I've been—" She shook her head. "I've been thinking about why. And I think it's because I've gotten used to staying quiet when staying quiet is easier. And I don't want to be that person." She held his gaze. "So, that's what I wanted to say." He looked at her. He thought about the 17 people in the corridor. He thought about the specific courage of saying the hard thing after the moment has passed, when you can't pretend you're still in the moment and you have to just own the gap. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. He went to Bay 4. 3 weeks later, Commander Whitford called. Not for more testimony. The debrief was closed, the formal case package submitted. He called because there was something he wanted to say that wasn't administrative and wasn't procedural, and which he'd apparently been thinking about how to say for a few weeks. "There's a program," Whitford said, "joint medical and investigative training, combat medicine intersecting with civilian infrastructure, hospitals, emergency response systems, the points where healthcare and federal operations overlap. We've been developing it for 2 years, and it's been underdeveloped because we don't have people who understand both sides." A pause. "I want to offer you a consulting role. Part-time, your schedule, based wherever you are. Working with the program to build the curriculum, occasionally running workshops for active personnel." Another pause. "It uses what you know, all of what you know, not just the medicine and not just the tactical background, the thing that made you stay in a building at midnight when you didn't have to. The judgment. You can't train that directly, but you can train around it, and having someone who has it in the room makes a difference." Mason was sitting on his porch. The evening was doing something good with the light. Grady was visible on his porch next door doing the complete activity of watching the day end. "Can I keep my floor position?" Mason asked. Whitford paused. "The program isn't full-time. It's designed around your primary role, whatever that is." "Then yes," Mason said. "I'm in." He heard Whitford's exhale, the specific exhale of a man who'd been carrying a question and had set it down. "There's one more thing," Whitford said. "The program's first cohort. We're doing a formal launch session in 30 days. There's a recognition component. Personnel who contributed to the case that resulted in the task force. Dre will be there. Aldridge. Senior investigators. And we'd like you to be formally recognized in that proceeding." He paused. "Not as a contractor or a witness, as someone who was essential to the outcome." Mason looked at the light on the ridge. "I'll be there," he said. The recognition session happened on a Thursday, which Mason noted because Thursday was when Grady got the good chips, and Marcus's tree play had happened, and when he'd called his sister back. Thursday had apparently become a thing. It was a federal facility in Nashville, a conference room full of people who did difficult work quietly and understood that the person next to them probably did too. Dre was there, still moving carefully around his healing ribs, with the particular energy of someone who has come back from a long way away and is still calibrating the return. He and Mason shook hands and stood next to each other and didn't need to say much because they were the kind of people who understood what had happened between them without needing to perform it for the room. Aldridge said things about the task force and the case and the outcomes. Whitford said things about the program and the people in it. Several other people said things that were true and well chosen. When Mason's name was called and he stood, he was aware of the room in the specific way he'd learned to be aware of rooms. Every angle, every face, every point of entry and exit. He was aware of Dre beside him, and Voss in the second row, and Moss near the back, and Whitford at the front, and Aldridge with the folder that contained the formal commendation that would go into the corrected record. He was aware that he was still a person who couldn't sleep on the right side of the bed, and sometimes counted steps without meaning to, and would probably always notice exits before entrances. That 3 years of quiet had changed some things, and not changed others, and that the things it hadn't changed were, he was beginning to understand exactly what had been needed. He accepted the commendation. He shook the hands that were extended. He said thank you because that was the right thing, and he meant it. Afterward, in the corridor outside, Voss found him. "How does it feel?" she asked. He thought about the question honestly, which took a moment. "Like it means something," he said. "And also like tomorrow morning I'm going back to a hospital corridor in Tennessee." "Is that a bad thing?" "No," he said. And that was also true, more completely than it had been 3 weeks ago. "It's the right thing." She nodded, looked at him for a moment with that professional read that had been on him since 2 in the morning of what felt like a different life and was actually 11 days ago. "You know what I kept thinking about?" she said. "When you came out of that stairwell at 5:40 a.m., 2 men down, completely controlled, and then you just said you needed to check on your patients. They needed checking on." "I know. That's what I mean." She paused. "You never stopped being a nurse." He thought about that, about all the things it contained. "I'm also a lot of other things," he said. "I've just been spending 3 years figuring out how they fit together." She nodded once, and that was the right response, and they went back into the room where the work was. Here is what the story of Mason Reed is actually about, though he would not say it this way because he didn't traffic in abstractions and wouldn't have trusted anyone who did. It's about what happens when the wrong people decide what you are. When they look at the evidence of your life and select only the parts that confirm what they already think. No advanced degree, no specialty certifications, no performance, no noise, and declare that the sum of you is less than they require. It's about the specific violence of being dismissed by someone with authority in public, in front of people who could have said something and didn't, and having to decide what you do with that. Mason Reed went back in, not to prove anything, not for them, because someone needed help and he was the person who could provide it. That's the whole mechanism. It's unglamorous and it doesn't make a good speech, and it's also exactly what kept a man alive and brought down a network that had been operating for years under institutional cover and brought answers to 7 families who had been waiting in a particular kind of darkness. The people who dismiss you are often dismissing themselves from something they needed. The quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who has done the hardest thing and chosen not to make noise about it. The person who doesn't perform competence is sometimes the person who has moved past needing to. And the institutions that pushed Mason out, that called him mediocre, that shaped his evaluation to close a career they found inconvenient, didn't defeat him. They delayed him. There's a difference, though it doesn't always feel like one in the moment. And in the moment is where you have to keep going. He kept going. Tuesday night in a parking lot, cold coffee in a cup holder, a scanner crackling on the passenger side floor. He kept going not because he was extraordinary, but because he was the kind of person who had decided, at some point before the story started, that going was what you did, that the work was the work, that the people in the rooms needed someone who would stay. He was that someone. He went back in. That was enough. That was, in the end, more than enough.